I'm Amber, 29 years old, and I was painting the railings of a children's classroom in the floodplains of the Philippines when my phone rang. It was a message from my mother. "We've changed all the locks. You no longer have a home." My fingers trembled as I typed back, "That's funny." 3 simple words, but inside I was shattered. My grandmother's house, legally mine according to her will, had just been stolen from me by my own parents. I know many families fall apart because of inheritance, but I never imagined that mine, once so good and solid, would crumble too, caught in the same trap called inheritance. Before you decide whether I'm right or my family is wrong, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe if you've ever been hurt by a family inheritance. I still remember the dry, sun-baked scent mixed with the musty smell of old paper from the school library where my father, Mason, worked as a security guard, and the late afternoons when my mother, Caroline, in her faded gray dress, quietly tallied books on wooden shelves warped from humidity. My family wasn't wealthy, but we weren't poor either. We lived in a modest 2-story house on the outskirts of Orlando, where summers stretched into October, and the cicadas never seemed to stop singing. I used to think my childhood was peaceful, at least compared to many other kids. I had both parents, a warm enough home, dinner every day, and little birthday presents. But the older I got, the more I could feel a quiet tension, never loud or explosive, but constant, like water dripping from a leaky roof, seeping into every crack of my soul. My parents, they weren't bad people, but whenever money came up, especially large expenses like a new washing machine, a weekend getaway, or even the old fridge starting to leak electricity, a storm would rise in our house. Not the kind of storm filled with shouting and slammed doors, but a cold, bitter one that stretched across dinner into the sleepless nights, where I lay listening to my mother's soft sighs and the creaking of the bed every time my father turned over, full of a silent, unspoken fury. I learned to be quiet very early on. I could tell when my mother was angry, even if she smiled. I knew when my father was about to snap, even if he hadn't said a word. Some days, I felt like I was walking barefoot on a sheet of glass. One careless question and everything would shatter. Jason, my younger brother, was different. He seemed immune to those silent rules. He was carefree, loud, and often forgiven, whether he broke a glass, forgot his homework, or blatantly lied. I was jealous, but I didn't blame him, because in a family where everyone looked at each other like strangers, the one who stirred things up somehow felt more alive. If I had to name the one person who took my hand and led me out of the shadows of silence and the long loneliness of my childhood, it would be Penelope, my mother's mother, who never once made me feel like a stranger in my own life. She was the only one in my family who truly saw me, not for being good or obedient or agreeable, but simply for being me. At nearly 90, she carried with her a kind of old-world grace, like she'd stepped out of a page from an old English novel. Her silver hair always neatly pinned, long cream-colored dresses, and a faint scent of lavender lingering at her wrists. Her house, a 2-story Victorian wooden home by Lake Apopka, felt like stepping into another world. A white arched gate covered in moss, a winding stone path leading to a porch wrapped in ivy. In that garden, I learned how to grow roses without chemical fertilizer, how to wait patiently all summer for a single bud to bloom, and more importantly, how to listen to the voice within myself. Penelope never raised her voice, never needed to, but every word she spoke carried a gentle weight, as if steeped in time and filled with quiet understanding. She once told me, "You know, Amber, some houses are just for living in, but some, like this one, are meant to hold memories. Not because of the wood or the bricks, but because of the stories living in each stone on the floor." I didn't fully understand then, but as I sat with her under the wild grapevine, reading old books and listening to the breeze rustle the lace curtains, I began to see. Sometimes we need a place to settle our hearts, not to escape, but to heal. Whenever my parents fought, I would quietly slip away to her place. No explanations needed. There was always a warm cup of tea and a pair of woolen slippers waiting under the table. She never asked, "Are you okay?" She just let me sit beside her, in silence. And that silence, without judgment, without demands, healed me more than any comforting words ever could. Under her guidance, I grew up believing that I had the right to be loved without needing to prove anything, and that if the world outside was too chaotic, I could build a more peaceful one within. I learned that a house can be repainted, refurnished, even filled with different people, but if it loses the stories that shaped it, it becomes nothing more than a hollow shell, lovely yet soulless. And she, with hands that had begun to tremble as she watered her plants each morning, had spent her life keeping that soul alive. Once, when my mother visited and absent-mindedly remarked, "This place must be worth a lot now, huh?" She saw my grandmother's shoulders flinch. She didn't reply. She just got up, walked straight into the garden, and began cutting dried lavender stems. Later, when it was just the two of us, she said in a voice softer than the breeze, "Amber, there are some things, once turned into money, they never come back. This house is an inheritance, and you're the only one who understands that." I didn't fully grasp her meaning at the time, but that sentence etched itself into my mind for years afterward, even as everything in my life began to fall apart. That house, somehow, became a compass, a silent reminder whenever I felt lost. Penelope passed on an October morning, when the autumn sun still lingered over the lake like a dust-veiled mirror of time. I was there, sitting by her bed, holding the once strong hand of the woman who had planted the first seeds of peace in me, now nothing more than a frail branch, growing colder like a candle nearing its end. Her death wasn't sudden. She had lived a full 99 years, a long, deep life, quiet as the way she loved, but that didn't lessen the pain. If anything, the slow farewell made the emptiness more unbearable, like walking endlessly down a dark hallway, knowing the final door will close, yet unable to stop your heart from breaking when it does. On the day of her funeral, the house overflowed with people, distant relatives, elderly neighbors who once received her apple pies on Christmas, even faces I barely recognized as childhood friends of my mother. But to me, none of them truly knew her the way I did. None had sat under the grapevine at 4 p.m., listening to the soft clink of spoons on porcelain and stories of my late grandfather, told in a deep voice and distant, glistening eyes. I expected nothing from the will. Truly, I had never thought of inheritance. To me, the greatest legacy she left was the summers filled with lavender, her garden journal written in neat purple ink, and her quiet, unwavering presence in every embrace. But then, a month later, when the lawyer opened the ivory envelope containing her final will, and the room was so silent I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, I heard my name. Not as part of a general listing, not as a small memento, but as the heir to the entire house. I could hardly believe it. The entire house, the place that held her whole life, every photograph, every rug, every window pane marked with my childhood, she left it all to me. And when I turned and saw the stunned faces of my parents, I suddenly understood that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. My mother's brow furrowed, her lips pressed tightly as if holding back a storm. My father said nothing, but the look in his eyes, cold and vacant, made me feel like I had just betrayed something, though I had done nothing wrong. In the will, Penelope had written clearly, "I leave this house to Amber, because she is the only one who understands its soul and will care for it as I always hoped." No judgment, no reproach, just a quiet, resolute choice, unmistakably Penelope. I left that meeting with my heart pounding, not from joy, but from a deep intuition that this wouldn't end with surprise. I had lived long enough in this family to know no one truly forgets being sidelined. And I was right, because just a few days later, the undercurrents began to stir, from the very people who shared my last name. 3 days later, I gave up the cramped apartment I had rented since college and returned to the lakeside home my grandmother had left to me. As I stepped inside, I noticed a change in my mother's eyes, an expression I had only ever seen when someone deeply disappointed her. In my father's every gesture, there was a subtle coldness, as if I was a mislabeled package, a misdirected gift from Penelope. And Jason, my younger brother, the one who had always been spoiled as a matter of course, blurted out without hesitation, "Don't you think it's, unfair? I mean, don't you see something wrong with taking the house when everyone expected it to be mine?" I didn't respond, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew, in Jason's eyes at that moment, I was no longer his sister, but someone holding something he believed was his. And the deepest hurt didn't come from what he said, but from the fact that our parents, standing behind him, nodded silently in agreement. They started talking about what's fair, about family norms, and how Jason was the rightful grandson, the male heir, even though he'd never cared for the house except during the rare holiday. I still kept the old habit, each morning after brewing a cup of chamomile tea just the way Penelope had taught me. I would sit in the wicker chair on the porch, facing the still waters of Lake Apopka, so still it mirrored the haze in my heart. Perhaps I was naive to think that a cup of tea, a quiet morning, and a familiar porch could mend the fractures that had grown too deep between me and my family. But I tried, with all sincerity. I began inviting my parents over for small holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, even sunny Saturday afternoons. I kept Penelope's old teacup set, arranged the table exactly how she loved, Whiteley's tablecloth, softly scented candles and vases of roses cut from the garden. Not perfect, but heartfelt. I told old stories, brought up summers we once spent dining under the porch, back when Jason was still young and not yet absorbed in social media, when Dad could smile at Mom without raising his voice. I did everything to show them I wasn't trying to divide. I only wanted to hold on to the good things that had once existed in this family, in my own way, in the space Penelope had entrusted to me. I thought if they saw me preserving the traditions, remembering Mom's old recipes, carefully keeping the framed photos my grandmother had chosen, they'd understand. They'd soften. But what I didn't expect was this. The more I tried to hold on, the more visible the distance became, not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I no longer fit their idea of what was right. I wasn't the obedient daughter anymore. I was the legal owner of a family asset, an independent force no longer within the control they'd grown used to for over 30 years. My mother, during one of her rare visits for dinner, sat in silence most of the evening, occasionally offering cutting remarks like, "This pink color clashes with the wood," or "That curtain looks cheap, why didn't you ask me first?" I didn't argue. I just smiled quietly and glanced at Penelope's portrait above the fireplace, reminding myself to stay calm, stay soft, and not let the evening drown in old bitter waters. Jason, on the other hand, didn't hold back. He sprawled on the sofa as if it were his own and scoffed, "You repainted the house without consulting a professional? Looks like an 80s movie set." Then laughed like it was just harmless fun. I wanted to believe they just weren't ready, that they needed time to adjust, to see me not as someone who stole the legacy, but as the one who was protecting it. But deep down, I began to realize they weren't just angry about the house. They were angry about losing their place in my story. And from there, I began to see a truth more painful than any insult. Some relationships, no matter how bound by blood, can become so foreign and unstable that every attempt to draw closer only wounds you further.
I haven't given up, but in my heart, I have started to prepare for the day when I might have to walk a path without them. And I don't know yet, that day might be closer than I think. One time, I was standing in the kitchen, carefully arranging the spice jars and ceramic bowls left from my grandmother's time, when I heard my mother sigh softly behind me. Just one sigh, but it froze the entire room. I turned and asked, "Is something wrong, Mom?" And she just shook her head. "No, it's just your grandmothers used to do things differently." I wanted to ask, different how? Better? More correct? Easier to control? But I said nothing. I knew that any question at that moment would be interpreted as defiance. Michael, the only person besides me who truly understood the house, had often advised me to set clear boundaries. He saw what I was still avoiding, that my mother wasn't visiting because she missed Grandma or wanted to reconnect, but to reclaim a power she felt slipping away. A nameless kind of power, rooted in old habits, in the belief that adults are always right, even when they're wrong. One afternoon, after my mother left for a short visit, Michael looked at me and said, "I think you're trying to rebuild your grandmother's house, but you're still letting your mother hold the keys." His words left me frozen for hours, because he was right. I had believed that if I was patient enough, gentle enough, respectful enough, then love would be the glue and people would find their way back to each other. But maybe I'd forgotten something vital. Love can't grow where people only see you as a flawed version of themselves. And while I wrestled with duty and self, with tradition and my own voice, my mother, quietly, silently, had begun to rearrange everything, not within my home, but around it. When I proposed turning a small part of the house, the glass sunroom behind the garden where Penelope once read, into a modest art exhibit space, I had no idea that this idea would become the spark that lit the smoldering anger between me and my family. The idea came to me one morning as sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, touching each old book lined up on the oak shelf, and I noticed the fine dust on the portrait of her sitting by the window, cradling her gardening journal. I remembered she once dreamed of creating a small display corner, a place where letters, handwritten notes, sketches, and family mementos could be shared with the community as a way to keep the soul of the house not just remembered, but alive. I didn't intend to turn it into a museum or a noisy tourist spot. I simply wanted a small space, open a few days a month, where people who cherish heritage and quiet beauty could experience a glimpse of her inner world. But when I carefully shared the idea with my parents and Jason, hoping the sincerity of my voice would help them see the deeper meaning, I was met with tense silence, and then a storm that felt like a courtroom trial. My mother nearly leapt from her seat. Her face went pale with anger, and though her voice stayed measured, it was laced with condemnation. "You want to turn your grandmother's house into some kind of amusement park? If she were still alive, she'd never allow that." I went numb, not from the accusation, but from the way she used my grandmother's name as a weapon, as if Penelope's love could now be redefined on her terms. My father, usually silent in arguments, spoke this time, his voice carrying a quiet disappointment I'd never heard so clearly. "You're going too far, Amber. This house is private family space, not something to display to strangers." Jason sneered, a smirk thick with disdain, an exhibit of what, old drawings, letters, dusty stuff? Who cares? You're making a mess. I felt like I was standing among strangers. I tried to keep my voice calm, explaining that it was a dream Penelope had shared many times. I even brought out her old notes where she sketched the room's layout, listed the items, and wrote in her delicate handwriting, "A house lives when it is shared, not just among kin, but with those who feel." But no one listened, or rather, they didn't want to. After the argument, my father, usually one to avoid confrontation, stood abruptly, walked out to the porch, and lit a cigarette he thought I didn't know he kept in his car. My mother stayed, turned her face to the window saying nothing, but her shoulders curled inward like someone betrayed. Jason quietly took his coat and left, never once looking back. I sat alone in the quiet living room, the breeze from Lake Apopka drifting through the window, carrying the scent of freshly blooming lavender, mixing with the cold jasmine tea in my porcelain cup. And I realize sometimes when we try to carry old values forward in a new way, the first ones to stand against us aren't our own family.
In June, as the first storms rolled across the Philippines, I was on a 2-week volunteer trip with Michael, helping to rebuild classrooms for children in flood-prone areas. That day, I had just finished painting the last set of railings when my phone buzzed. I thought it was a message checking in on me or maybe an update from the church group. But when I saw the message, it felt like my heart was being squeezed. It wasn't concern, it was a message from my mother, so cruel it sent a chill down my spine. Locks changed. You don't have a home anymore. I read it over and over, hoping I had mistranslated, that the harsh midday light of a foreign land had made me misread it. But no, the message was real, brutally, precisely real. I couldn't call, no signal, too late at night, and my throat had closed up, unable to form words. I stood frozen by the freshly painted wall, white paint still on my hands, feeling like a part of my soul had been torn from my body. That night I told Michael. He urged me to fly home the next morning. But no, after 2 rush days, our work was finished, and I booked a flight that same night. The moment I landed in Orlando, I didn't bring my suitcase home, didn't stop by Michael's place. I went straight to Lake Apopka. The familiar road, once my refuge from the noise of the world, felt longer now, darker, heavier than ever before. I remember that afternoon clearly. It didn't rain, but the cold wind crept through my clothes and under my skin like a warning of the storm to come, no longer a metaphor. As soon as the car stopped at the gate, I sensed something was wrong. The front of the house had been painted in a loud, garish color, something Penelope would never have approved of, something that matched Jason's flashy taste more than the classic grace my grandmother had cherished. The flower beds I had tended were gone, replaced by dusty, artificial plants. The handcrafted wooden sign, "Welcome," was no longer there, replaced with a gold-plated sign that read, "The future home of Jason and Marla, wedding in 2 weeks." I couldn't open the door. The locks had been changed. The key, the only one Penelope had personally given me, no longer fit. I knocked, no answer. I called out, nothing, but I could hear music blasting from inside. Loud pop music Jason always played during his live streams. And then I saw them, black trash bags lining the porch steps. I approached and opened one, and my heart shattered into pieces. Inside were my belongings, old notebooks, my grandmother's sketches, the hand-embroidered tablecloths I used to wash with lavender water, all crammed in, mixed and jumbled, with no care, no notice. Some bags were torn, revealing a chipped picture frame, a broken porcelain dish, and the journal I used to document the renovation of the house, the one I had imagined passing down to my daughter one day. Jason stepped out, beer in hand, his smile triumphant. I looked at him, my brother, and in that moment, I no longer recognized his face, not because he had changed, but because I finally saw him clearly without the haze of familial affection. I turned away. My eyes didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because I was completely drained. As I stepped off the porch I used to clean every Sunday morning, I knew this wasn't just about property anymore. The next morning, I returned to the house at 9 a.m. The door was still locked, but through the large window of the living room where Penelope once placed her cherrywood reading table, I could see everything had been replaced. The familiar objects that once held the quiet warmth of the room were gone. The wooden table had vanished. The beige fabric lamp I repaired with her old sewing thread gone. In their place were glossy, angular modern furnishings, objects suited for Instagram photos, but alien to the spirit of the home. On my phone, I saw the photos Jason had publicly posted, Penelope's cherished paintings taken down, replaced with music posters and a nameplate that read Jason and Marla's Nest.
The kitchen, once filled with the scent of her baking, had been remodeled into a bar-style setup, complete with neon lights and glass shelves for cocktail glasses. Outside, the garden we had tended by hand, from each lavender root to the ivy vines on the trellis, was gone, replaced by bare concrete, a few crooked, faux antique chairs, and a sign that read, "Wedding Ceremony Area Private Event." And what hurt most wasn't the new paint or the garish wedding sign on the porch. It was standing on those steps, seeing the same trash bags still there from the day before, and realizing no one had bothered to move them. No one believed I held anything of worth. I stepped forward, opened a bag, not to check, but as a painful reflex of memory refusing to accept. The items that had been part of my life, the embroidered handkerchief with her initials, the framed painting we hung together during one special winter, were now buried beneath shredded paper, old tape, even pizza boxes. Nothing retained its former dignity. Worse, the original will was missing. The cherished paintings Penelope had kept safe, gone. Nothing remained. Only a growing void in my chest, dark, cold, and so deep no sound could reach its bottom. Jason stepped out, beer in hand again, grinning with unashamed pride. He lifted his phone, took a selfie with the wedding sign behind him, and posted it right there, with the caption, "Welcome to our new nest. Everything's finally in its right place." I stood still, not from shock, but because I never imagined being erased so blatantly from my own family's history. That feeling, not just anger, but a deep, aching silence, was a pain too profound to name. I asked Jason, my voice hoarse, "Where are her paintings? Where's the original will?" He shrugged, his phone still in hand, eyes glued to the screen. "Ask Mom, I'm not involved in any of that." I turned away, hollow inside, and walked to the car where Michael was waiting. He said nothing, just opened the door and placed his hand over mine. A silent promise that I wasn't alone. And in that moment, more clearly than ever, I knew I had lost the house. Not legally, but because the people who should have stood beside me had chosen to turn away. And for the first time, after years of silence, I began to consider the word I had always avoided: resistance. That night I slept on Michael's old sofa, not because there weren't any spare rooms, but because I didn't want to be separated from anything real anymore. I needed an anchor, close, human, to remind myself that I still existed, that I hadn't faded like the photographs thrown in the trash, or the keepsakes scrubbed from the memory of the house I once belonged to. Michael didn't say much. He made me a cup of ginger tea, placed it beside a soft pillow, and sat on the floor across from me, quietly typing on his laptop as he always did, but his eyes were on me, calm and gentle, like a lamp that never went out no matter how fierce the wind outside. I stayed silent for a long time, maybe a whole hour. Only the ticking clock in the kitchen and the occasional whoosh of passing cars broke the stillness. Then finally, when I'd gathered enough calm to string the pieces together, I turned to him and said, my voice barely recognizable, "They changed the locks, threw my things out like trash, and Jason acted like I never even existed in that house." Michael looked at me for a long moment. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," didn't ask, "Are you sure?" He didn't try to comfort me with worn-out sympathy. He just nodded, slowly, and said, "What they did was wrong, not just emotionally, but legally. You're not crazy. You're not selfish. You didn't imagine this, and you have every right to stand up." I froze. For months, I had wrestled in silence, surrounded by judgment and doubt from those I once called family. No one had said that to me. Not clearly, not confidently, not without hesitation. Just 5 short sentences, but they felt like someone finally untied the invisible knot that had been choking me all this time. Michael picked up his phone, and called a friend, William Nguyen, a lawyer he trusted. The call was brief, just a few minutes, but I knew from that moment things had shifted. No more endurance, no more hoping people would come around. This was action, clear, lawful, and unwavering. Before we went to bed, Michael turned to me and said, like sealing a quiet vow, tomorrow we begin. I lay there, eyes open, staring at the ceiling with streaks of light coming through the thin curtain. The pain was still there, still raw, but beneath that pain I felt something I hadn't dared hope for in a long time. A flicker of warmth, faint, but real. Maybe I hadn't lost everything. Maybe amidst those who turned away, there was someone brave enough to stand beside me, not out of obligation or gain, but because they believed I was worth protecting. And maybe the flame Penelope once lit in me, the one for preservation, for justice, for dignity, had never gone out. It was just waiting for the right wind to rise again.
The next morning, before the sun had cut through the thin mist across the porch, I was sitting at Michael's kitchen table, gripping a coffee cup he'd just made, eyes locked on some invisible point in space. Inside me, there was a fear that felt real, not vague or hidden behind disappointment, but sharp and undeniable, the fear of doing something I had never dared before, suing my own family. William Nguyen arrived on time, a Vietnamese-American man in his 30s, dressed simply but with precise movements, his gaze sharp like a blade wrapped in silk. He didn't ask many questions, didn't rush to conclusions. He just listened, intently, carefully, to every detail I shared, every document I handed over, every small piece of evidence I'd kept, even when I wanted to throw it all away, believing it was useless without people willing to see. When I described the lock change, showed him the message from my mother with its icy finality, "You don't have a home anymore," and especially when he saw the notarized copy of Penelope's will, fully signed and legally validated, he said one sentence, steady and clear. "Amber, this is asset theft. It's completely illegal. You have the right to sue, and you should." I was silent for a long time. My heart raced, not from fear of losing, but because I knew that once I opened the door to the law, there was no going back to being the daughter trying to keep the family together. Once I stepped into that space, I wasn't the little girl hiding behind her grandmother when voices were raised. I was the plaintiff, the one standing upright in court, declaring that she had been betrayed by the very people who gave her life. I looked at Michael, his gaze unwavering. He nodded gently as if to say, "You're not alone." I tightened my grip on the coffee cup, then placed it down, took a deep breath, long and measured, and said to William, "Then let's begin. I'm not backing down." William got to work swiftly and precisely. He filed an emergency motion with the court to immediately prevent Jason and the family from continuing to use the house as their own. He requested restoration of my access and began documenting all unauthorized alterations, paint color, furniture changes, and the disappearance of items with emotional and material value. In the process, I realized I wasn't just reclaiming a house, I was reclaiming dignity, the dignity of a woman once deemed weak for trying too hard to keep the peace. I was reclaiming a promise made to my grandmother that I would protect that home even if the whole world turned away. And every time my hands trembled signing another document, every time I lifted my head toward the gray clouded sky above the law office, I remembered Penelope's eyes the last time I saw her, eyes filled with sorrow and resolve, as if she had always known this day would come when I would have to rise alone. That day, as I stood outside the law office, looking at my reflection in the glass, I no longer saw the Amber who used to avoid conflict, who quietly sacrificed to be the good daughter. She was gone. In her place stood a woman fighting for justice, not just for herself, but for generations of women who were dismissed, silenced, in the name of a peace that was nothing more than a mask for injustice. And I knew, from this point forward, I was no longer living in the past. I was writing the future.
I used to think that the hardest part of filing a lawsuit, especially against your own family, would be proving right from wrong in the eyes of the law. But I was wrong. The most painful part wasn't the courtroom. It was watching the people who once called me daughter, sister, blood, twist me into something bitter and an alien. A version of myself so distorted that if I didn't know who I truly was, I might have started to doubt it myself. Just days after the suit was filed, anonymous messages started flooding in, many from accounts tied to friends of my mother's on Facebook. They shared a long public post written by my mother, one that didn't mention me by name, but left no room for doubt. It was a mix of false morality, grief, and veiled condemnation. Somewhere along the way, family tradition became a burden. Some young people today no longer understand the sacrifices of those before them. They're even willing to drag the dead into lawsuits just to satisfy their selfish egos. The post garnered hundreds of shares and comments. Some expressed sympathy for a mother betrayed by her own daughter. Others sneered. Kids these days get a bit of inheritance and turn on everyone. Even old acquaintances, people who once sat across from me at Thanksgiving dinner, left comments like, "Amber seems like she's changed a lot." I read every word, not to count how many had turned away, but to mark clearly, I no longer lived in the same world as them. My father, silent for years, finally spoke, not to me directly, but through a voice message sent to Michael's phone. It was just over a minute. His voice was cold, flat, devoid of anger or warmth. "You're digging a hole for this family. If you're still our daughter, drop the suit. Don't make us choose." Choose. A word that sounds like fairness, but is really an ultimatum. Either I stay silent, or they cut me off. I listened to that message over and over, not because I didn't understand, but to confirm his voice didn't tremble. He didn't hesitate. There was no trace of reluctance, just finality, like I had already died, and all that was left was the paperwork to erase me. I sat in silence for hours afterward, curled into myself on Michael's couch, not crying, not even breathing deeply, just still, as if trying to shield myself from a storm I couldn't see but felt all around. And in my head, a quiet, cruel question repeated, am I becoming the villain in someone else's story? Michael came and sat beside me. He didn't try to pull me out of my thoughts, didn't say, "You're doing the right thing," or "Don't care what they think." He just placed a hand on my back, patting gently, steadily, tenderly, like saying, "It's okay to hurt. I'm here." I didn't know what lay ahead, whether I'd win or lose, keep something or lose it all. But in that moment, I saw something clearer than ever before. Those who truly love you won't force you to choose between justice and artificial peace. They'll stand with you, even if you become the villain in others' eyes, so long as your heart remains clean. And if I had to become a betrayer of tradition to protect what's right, then so be it. Because some traditions, if they only exist to silence and suppress, are better off broken.
Amid threats becoming more direct as social media turned into a public trial painting me as a villain, even former aunties calling me by name in scorn or pity, something unexpected happened. Not from the court, not from lawyers, but from a quiet, shaking voice, familiar yet distant, Uncle James, Penelope's youngest brother. A man I'd met only a few times but remembered for his gentle eyes and the way he'd pause for a long time before saying anything at all. He called on a Friday afternoon while I was sitting in William's law office preparing more evidence. His voice trembled, not from age but from the weight of what he was about to say, something I sensed he had carried far too long. "Amber, I know what's happening, and I know you're not wrong. I've been silent for over a year, but maybe it's time." I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just listened. His broken breaths, the hum of an old ceiling fan, like time slowing down. Uncle James told me that months before Penelope passed, my parents had visited and tried to pressure her to change her will. They argued Jason was the only male heir, that I had no family of my own, didn't need a big house, and wouldn't uphold tradition. Their tone escalated, implying that if she didn't transfer the deed to Jason, they would stop caring for her, put her in a nursing home, and let strangers manage family property. Uncle James had been there by chance. He didn't speak up, afraid it would escalate further, but he recorded the entire conversation on a mini tape recorder he had used since his days as a high school history teacher. Not just audio, he also filmed a short video on an old phone. It was shaky, low res, but clear enough to catch voices, body language, and Penelope's face. Angry, afraid. She cried, and she said clearly, "I'm leaving the house to Amber, not because she asked, but because she understands. Don't force me to regret this," he recalled, voice breaking. I couldn't hold back my tears. Not only because it confirmed what I always knew in my heart, but because of the pain she must have felt, being manipulated, threatened by her own children in her final days. They had weaponized love, turned care into coercion, exploiting the very loneliness they once promised to shield her from. Uncle James asked me to visit that evening. Michael drove, William came too, to verify the authenticity of the materials. The uncle's house was tucked away on a leafy street where summer arrived slowly and winter never bit too hard, like the temperament of someone old enough to know what's worth holding on to and what should be let go. In a moss-green tin box, Uncle James handed me two things: a USB with copies of the audio and video recordings, and a handwritten document detailing the date, location, and contents of the conversation. I clutched the box as if it were Penelope's final embrace, the one where she didn't need to defend me with words, only with the truth. William kept it brief, but I could hear the approval in his voice. This changes everything. And for the first time in months, I looked up at the night sky above Uncle James's roof, no longer feeling trapped, but open, wide, star-strewn. Those stars had always been there. But it wasn't until now, after enough pain, clarity, and stubborn hope, that I could finally see them. In the darkness where my family tried to bury me, one of them stepped forward to shine a light. And sometimes one person, one honest voice, is all it takes to know I am not alone in this fight.
When William opened the laptop in the middle of his office and the first crackling voice came through the recording, it was my mother's. Hoarse, faintly distorted, but chillingly clear. The same soft tone that had often misled people into believing she was a woman of patience and sacrifice. Only now, every word carried a bare, cutting coldness, sharpened by years of repression never once questioned. If you're still in your right mind, you should know you're handing over the family's legacy to someone who won't preserve it. Amber doesn't understand this house the way Jason does. If you don't revise the will, don't expect us to keep looking after you. Then came my father's voice, lower, rougher, spoken in clipped fragments, as if the words were so heavy even he knew he was crossing a line. Don't make us send you to a nursing home sooner than needed. William paused the audio. The room fell silent. Even I, who had always known the truth, felt my hands go cold, as though I'd just plunged them into icy water. Because some truths, when spoken aloud, hurt more than when they're only suspected. We had the recording, the video, the witness testimony, the exact time and place, the consistency. No lawyer, no matter how skilled, could deny that Penelope's final wishes had been pressured, and the fact that I was the legal heir was no accident of sentiment, but a decision my grandmother fought for until the end against the very people who should have defended her. The day William filed the evidence in court, I went with him. I brought nothing but a folder of documents and an old silk scarf of Penelope's, the one thing that still held her scent through all the chaos. I sat outside, gently stroking the edge of the scarf, picturing her sitting by the window, faraway gaze, frail hands holding a teacup, an emblem of quiet strength that never needed to raise its voice to be heard. When William stepped out of the room, he simply nodded, calm, resolute. The courts accepted it. And not just for property rights, we're filing for damages, emotional and material. He said we, and the way he used that word made my eyes sting. I wasn't alone anymore. Not like the day I knocked on my own door and was denied, not the woman trembling as her belongings were dumped like nameless trash. I was now a plaintiff, with evidence, with support, with the resilience forged in sleepless nights and silent tears. William tallied the damages, original living room furniture and replaced,
heirloom paintings missing, the will vanished, and notably, the classic exterior paint overwritten with garish colors utterly at odds with the century-old architecture. I read each line like I was reading the resume of my own heartbreak. Every item was a wound, not just of lost possessions, but of violation, betrayal, and the calculated erosion of trust carried out quietly, ruthlessly. And I knew after that day, this wasn't about a house anymore. It had become a declaration that some legacies must be protected, not because they're beautiful, but because they carry the voices of those forced into silence. And I, who had been silent too long, would now speak for the memory that could no longer protect itself. I don't remember whether the sun shone the day of the trial, whether it rained, whether light filtered into the quiet courtroom. My entire memory of that morning feels coated in a milky haze, as though my mind veiled everything to shield my heart from overwhelming emotion. I sat in the plaintiff's seat, back straight, hands resting calmly on my lap, eyes forward, not toward Jason, not toward my parents, but to the bench where justice would speak. Slowly perhaps, hoarsely maybe, but without distortion. When the recording played, the courtroom was so still I could hear my own stuttering breaths. My mother's voice rang out, undeniable. William played just 2 minutes. No argument. No embellishment. The truth was heavy enough to stand on its own. Jason didn't look at me. My mother lowered her head, shoulders curling inward. My father's face froze, like a stone carving molded from resentment. But I didn't watch them for signs of remorse. I wasn't waiting to be understood. I was waiting for the law to speak, for the voice that I had once been taught to bury in order not to damage the family. When the judge read the verdict, his voice wasn't loud or sharp, but unwavering. The house legally belonged to me. The act of taking it was coercive, unlawful, and a violation of personal property. Jason and my parents were ordered to return the property, compensate for damages, over $45,000, and restore several elements altered without the heir's consent. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply closed my eyes for just a moment and felt Penelope's hand rest gently on my shoulder. No apparition, no sound, just the memory of warmth my skin still knew from years long past. That afternoon, I returned to the house. For the first time in months, I stepped onto the porch without sneaking, without rejection, without a useless old key, but with an official court order that said, "You belong here." I called in a painter, instructed them to strip the garish paint and return the facade to its original soft ivory. I searched for lace curtains identical to the ones she used. I spent 2 full days cleaning every window frame, every cabinet groove, washing not just dust, but the warped memories others had tried to stamp onto this home. The painting of Penelope in the garden, the one I thought lost, was found in storage, wrapped hastily in a plastic bag covered in tape. I peeled it back, cleaned each corner, and hung it again in its place above the fireplace, where the afternoon light could once more touch the curve of her smile. That night, I changed the locks with my own hands. Every turn of the screwdriver, every screw tightened, I told myself, I'm locking away an old era where I bent to preserve false peace, where I stayed silent for the sake of family appearances. And I'm opening a new chapter where I live not as a supplicant, but as a guardian. The house hadn't magically changed. It was still old, its floor still scuffed, one door still creaked. But to me, it had never glowed brighter, not because I'd won a court case, but because I'd kept it the way Penelope had taught me. Not through power, but through faith, reason, and a refusal to bow to injustice. And for the first time in months, I slept well. No dreams, no armor, just sleep. In my home.
I spent an entire afternoon sitting in the living room, simply staring at the empty space between two walls where the family portraits once hung. I had taken them down, not because I no longer saw myself as their daughter, not because I wanted to erase the past, but because I understood some images no longer reflect truth, only the remnants of an illusion that had hurt me far more than any material loss ever could. So I wrote a letter, not long, not angry, not accusatory, but a quiet, clear, non-negotiable statement. I wrote that from now on, this house is my private space, closed to those who had diminished my presence, denied Penelope's will, and participated in a theft they never showed remorse for. I wrote that I wasn't banning them out of hate, but because I needed to keep this house aligned with its original value, a safe place, free from contempt, manipulation, or emotional bargaining. I printed 3 copies, one for my mother, one for my father, and one for Jason. No emails, no texts, just plain white envelopes with their names handwritten in purple ink, the color Penelope used in her journals. A parting gesture. A reminder that her legacy no longer belonged to those who only spoke its name without understanding its worth. That evening, I stood on the porch, wind from Lake Apopka brushing through my hair, carrying the scent of fresh cut grass, early summer, and a peace I once thought was too far removed from my life. I held the new lock in my hand, pressed it in place with a soft click, and closed the iron gate. There was no argument behind me, no one shouting from afar, just me, and a peace that for the first time wasn't something I waited for others to bring me, but something I had created, kept, and defended with all I had endured. And I knew from that moment on, this house was no longer a symbol of pain. It was a beginning, a place I owned, a place where no one, no matter their title, could erase me from the story.
My little gallery, the dream once dismissed as foolish, finally opened. Quietly. No loud promotions, just a hand-carved wooded sign hanging beneath the porch eaves that read, Gallery Penelope, a space for untold memories. I chose that name after many sleepless nights because I knew this house wasn't just my story or Penelope's. It was a sanctuary for all the voices once pushed into the corners. Unsent letters, hidden manuscripts, unfinished paintings that no one had ever looked at with proper tenderness. On opening day, I didn't invite my parents. Not out of spite, but because I didn't want their presence to disturb the stillness I'd worked so hard to preserve. But I did invite the neighbors who once silently watched me clean my belongings off the front steps, the flower vendor at the weekend market who once gave me a cup of tea when I cried at the bus stop, even the mailman who slid court letters into my box without ever uttering a word of judgment. And they came. Not in crowds, not with fanfare, but with something deeply real, non-judgmental eyes, sincere praise, and a presence that asked for nothing but shared space. Michael stood beside me, hand in hand, not tight, not showy, just enough to remind me he was there, not for the ending, but for the journey. He was still the first to touch every painting I rehung, still the one who stepped back when I needed silence but moved forward the moment I began to tremble. And in each of those moments I felt a love that didn't flare or dazzle but held firm, like a foundation, like the earth, quietly unshakable. I began hosting Sunday afternoon readings where people once labeled as old, useless, or outdated gathered around a round table to read old poetry, share forgotten stories, and rediscover their worth. Once an elderly man stayed behind, held my hand, and whispered, "This house feels like memory rebuilt by the living." I didn't know what to say. I just smiled because I understood that sometimes the most beautiful thank you is being understood without explanation. That Christmas, for the first time in years, I didn't wait for a call from my parents. Not because I no longer hoped, but because I realized some relationships, if they're ever to return, must begin again in honesty, not performance. Michael and I visited his family that evening, where I was welcomed not as his girlfriend, but simply as myself. We ate dinner by warm golden light. No one asked about the lawsuit, no one mentioned the lakeside house, but I knew they knew. And it was their silence that embraced me more than any familiar phrase like, "Things will get better." That night, I returned home, opened the gallery room, looked up at Penelope's portrait, now restored in a new wooden frame, softly lit, and whispered, "We kept it. Not perfect, but true." And when I stepped onto the porch, letting the tailwind of winter pass through my hair, I knew. This was the first season. I wasn't living against anyone, but because I had chosen to live true to myself. And sometimes that alone is enough to call it a beginning. 6 months later, on a mild, early autumn morning, when the ash trees began to shift color, the sun no longer relentless, the wind softened, I stood before the tall mirror in the second-floor bedroom, wearing this simple wedding dress I had chosen myself. Not because someone suggested it, not for any tradition, but because I wanted to see myself as I am, unshaped, unmasked, unapologetically true. The ceremony was held in the backyard, the area once leveled, once cluttered with plastic chairs and an ugly event zone sign, now resurrected by my hands and memories. New lavender shrubs were planted, smaller, sparser, but smelling genuinely sweet. A climbing rose arbor was rebuilt from old pine wood. Thin string lights hung overhead, not elaborate, just enough to warm each step. Michael waited at the end of the stone path, dressed in an earthy toned suit, holding a simple bouquet. His gentle smile was the kind I'd only ever glimpsed in dreams I never shared. He said nothing as I approached. He simply smiled, and that smile, gentle as it was, anchored every quivering memory I'd once carried. I had sent invitations to my parents and Jason, not because I hoped they'd come, but because I needed to do the right thing. I wanted to give them the choice, even when they had already taken mine. They didn't come. No explanation, no reply, no message. And in those first few moments of the ceremony, my eyes landed on the empty seats in the front row, where I'd once imagined my mother wiping away tears, my father watching in silent pride, and Jason subtly nodding in blessing, and my throat clenched. Then I looked up and saw the ones who had been by my side all along, even when I thought I was alone. Michael, whose hand never left mine, no matter how many times I pushed it away. William, who built a bridge between me and justice with strength and integrity. Uncle James, his eyes red but shining. And the neighbors and townspeople, the silent witnesses of my journey, now clapping and smiling at me with genuine affection. I know my parents' absence will always leave a gap, not replaceable, not fillable, that it's no longer a wound, it's a scar, sometimes aching with the wind, but no longer steering my path. I spoke my vows not with a choked voice, but with the steadiness of someone once erased from her own home, who rebuilt it with memories, love, and unwavering self-trust. The reception was small, gentle. Melodious music, origami paper flowers, a 3-tiered cake lovingly made by a friend. Nothing extravagant, no ostentation, but everything was right. Right people, right place, right time. And as night fell and each light in the garden flickered on, I looked up and thought quietly, "Did you see, Grandma?" I kept my promise. I once believed family was what we were born into, but I have learned that sometimes family are the ones we choose to stay when all faith is tested. And if this journey has one final message, it's this.
Love isn't something to fight over. It isn't about holding others with guilt. It's a haven where you come without having to pretend. I reached the end of this journey, not with triumphant applause, not with praise, but with the peace I once thought only belonged to others. And I understand now what I have truly preserved is not just a house, but myself. And for someone once locked out by a single cruel message, that is everything. Have you ever had to reclaim something from your family? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this journey resonates, please like, subscribe, and share so others know that sometimes the bravest thing is standing up for yourself, even if it means standing against your own family. Thank you for walking this path with me today and always.